Today, it was my pleasure to have a conversation with Jonah Paquette, a clinical psychologist, author, and keynote speaker. Jonah is the author of Awestruck, How Embracing Wonder Can Make You Happier, Healthier, and More Connected. Jonah introduces us to the power of awe and how it can help alleviate struggles in our modern life, including stress, social isolation, and time pressure. It was a really enjoyable conversation for me, and I think that you'll enjoy it and come out of it with a little bit more of an appreciation for those moments of awe in our lives. Enjoy. Jonah, welcome to the Growth Guide podcast. We are going to dive into your book, Awestruck. And before we do, I'd love if you could start by sharing a little bit about yourself with our listeners so they're up to speed when we jump into your book.
Absolutely. So great to be here with you. Really honored to be on here. So I'm a clinical psychologist by trade. I'm out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, originally from New York, and I keep getting progressively further west, it seems. But yeah, essentially in a nutshell, my body of work has focused on well-being and sort of, I guess you would say, broadly speaking, applied positive psychology. So the science of well-being, emotional fitness. So ever since graduate school, really, even though we were learning so much about depression, anxiety, trauma, very important topics, I always felt myself gravitated much more towards the other side of the coin, understanding what constitutes the good life. What do we know about what works, what doesn't? So I've written 4 books over the years, including Awestruck, but all of them have that central theme really just around what are the skills, habits, behaviors that each of us can cultivate bit by bit to live a better life from a psychological standpoint? So that's really where my focus has been over the years. So I'm a clinical psychologist, a writer, an author, have a small practice, and then besides that, do quite a bit of speaking, writing, and things like this, which is a lot of fun.
And those are many of my favorite topics, how to live a good life. We could probably talk for days on this, so that this will be an exciting conversation. Where I thought it would be a good place to start is when we're talking about the concept of awe. What's the general definition that you would throw at the listeners? And what I'd love to cover in there is in the book, you talked about this idea of 2 main conditions that we need to cover, including perceptual vastness, conceptual vastness, transcendence, and accommodation. Those seem to be the tickets to get us into an awe state.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's often where I like to start because terms mean different things to different people. I think when it comes to awe, I think for most listeners, we know it when we feel it. We know it when we experience it. And so to some degree, it's trying to define an experience that's indefinable to some extent, which I recognize. I think on an informal definition, I think of awe as the moments that give us goosebumps, the moments that make us go, wow, in life. And I think that's honestly plenty good. But in terms of the research on awe, and that's really been an emerging field, subfield within positive psychology the last few years, they've started to center on 2 interconnected but distinct elements, so like 2 ingredients that you put them together and you experience awe. So the first is we experience or we encounter something that's vast, something that's bigger than us. And you mentioned the 2 subtypes of that, which would be like perceptual vastness or conceptual vastness. So you can think of like perceptual vastness, perceptions, things I can see, touch, feel, experience. If I look up at the night sky, if I gaze up at, an incredibly tall mountain, that would be examples of, perceptual vastness. But then you have, experiences that don't quite fit that, like watching Michael Jordan play basketball, or listening to an incredible piece of music, or, gazing up at a beautiful piece of art, or watching a child take their first steps. Those are vast, but they're not vast in the way the Grand Canyon is, but they're vast just as much. So that would be more in the idea realm or the experience realm. So that's vastness, either in the literal sense, the physical sense, or more of that idea sense. And then the second piece is this idea of transcendence, or it sometimes will be called accommodation. And what that basically means is there's something about the experience that makes us reevaluate what we thought we knew. It challenges our assumptions. It forces us to grow. It forces us to take in that experience. So the example I always like to give is if you have a beautiful environment near you, like the redwoods near me, if I saw those same exact redwoods every day where my office was, right, it's not going to give me that same transcendence quality because I know exactly what I'm going to see. Unfortunately, we'd get used to it. So whether you want to think of that like as an element of surprise to some degree, I think that's one way you can kind of make sense of that. But there's something about that experience that's new, that's fresh, that just pushes us beyond what we thought we knew about ourselves, the world, or others around us.
And on that point you made there, it's this weekend we're driving back from a basketball tournament, and as we're driving towards downtown, you see in the background beautiful mountains as far as the eye can see, snow capped. And my wife throws out, "Yeah, that's something we really take for granted, isn't it?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Yeah, because not only can we see those mountains, but those cranes that we see just below them, that's on the ocean to one of the largest ports in North America. So we have the ocean right there. And then in behind the ocean, we have these mountains that we can be skiing on or snowshoeing. And for a lot of people, they'll come here and say, wow, that's beautiful. It's amazing. Yeah. And for us, well, it's not. That's just our backyard. So it takes away a bit of that awe.
Yes. And I don't want listeners to feel bad about that in any way, because that is just what our mind does, right? We get used to good things. We get used to experiences that we see every day. If you want to think of that as hedonic adaptation, the hedonic treadmill. So just as you get used to those experiences, I have many out here in California that unfortunately the same is said. And part of what I wanted to write the book about is some of that's going to happen organically, just sort of living our lives. But I also think we can train ourselves bit by bit to see the wonder that surrounds us every day, but that we don't really realize even as wondrous. We can see how special things are that we see all the time. And so I think even when we talk about awe, it is easy, I recognize, to immediately jump in our mind and even in our conversation to things like that vista, the Grand Canyon, the night sky. But what I always encourage people to think about is look at how many things surround you right in this moment. If you're listening to this podcast, within your field of vision, that would have been absolutely mind-blowing and magical to someone even 50 years ago, let alone 500, 5,000, 50,000 years ago. Like, we really are surrounded by these miraculous parts of life that we just have blinders on so much of the time.
And for that one, you talk about the idea of really just being present in the current moment, in mindfulness. So when we're fast forwarding a little and we'll jump around and that's great. But how do people use that idea of the present moment and mindfulness to cultivate that sense of awe in their daily lives?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you could obviously, and you probably have had a number of guests that focus just on that piece of the puzzle. And I tend to think of it really as like a bi-directional relationship, in the sense that the more that we cultivate mindfulness, the more that we sort of build that mental muscle to be in the here and now, whether we're doing it in formal ways like meditation or informal ways like taking a walk and just noticing our surroundings more. As we start to develop our capacity for that, we are inevitably, in my opinion, going to notice more of these wonders of life that we just so often miss because we're in our head, we're looking down, we're not experiencing life. And simultaneously, the more that we experience awe, what we know from both kind of subjective experience and reports, but also even from some of those, incredible brain studies being done on experiences of awe, is it's one of the most centering, kind of grounding and present focused experiences we have. Like our brains are as present as you get. The noise completely tunes out when we experience these moments. So the more that we encounter awe, the more present we are. And also the more present we become, I think the more that we're going to notice the small wonders often that we miss.
And so when we think about awe, one of the things that I loved you talked about was this idea of the overview effect, which really highlights vastness at its most for probably most of humanity. Can you share with the listeners, what is the overview effect, and how have the researchers been trying to hack that overview effect?
Yeah. So this is a term that goes back actually to, I believe, the 70s, an astronaut by the name of Frank White, who coined it. But it really refers to the experience of, you know, the kind of experience that you and I and most listeners for now can only dream of. And hopefully that changes in the coming years and we get to experience ourselves. But this sort of account of looking down and seeing our huge planet reduced to the size of a small blue marble, looking at it from outer space. And they called this the overview effect. And it just, what's fascinating about it is you can think of it as like this mega dose of awe. It's like awe on steroids. There's not many experiences that are going to compare to that. But what was really interesting about it is, I'm not going to say universally because that's never the case, but so many of these astronauts that described feeling that experience came home forever changed. So like in some ways, what was most interesting, at least to me, was not the experience itself, but what happened afterwards. Some of them founded nonprofits. Some of them entered lifelong contemplative practices. Others kind of gave away their possessions and sort of reoriented their values. So it manifested in different ways, but across the board, you saw a lot of these sort of astronauts who had that mega dose of awe, that overview effect, change their life forever. And one of the things that you can, I think, draw a parallel to is even some of the emerging research on certain psychedelic states in terms of this just shift of trajectory, this shift of perspective. And, you always have to still work on that, right? It's sort of that opens the door of perception and then you have to keep walking through and continuing. But, not only have I seen some similarities there, but even if you look at some of what's happening in the brain with our default mode network kind of becoming completely offline, among others, there are some really, I think, unique similarities there between those two states.
And so when you think about the states that you're getting into with awe, and you talked about this idea of human evolution. Mm-hmm. And so as humans, most of the emotions we have tend to tie to safety and survival. When you think about awe, though, it's almost the opposite effect, right? I see this beautiful vista and I stop to stare at it and then I get eaten by the lion because I wasn't moving. So how is it that awe was an emotion that stayed with us? And you talk about social connection, generosity, curiosity, and researchers saying, hey, we think that awe creates these things, which is why it stayed with our people as we went through survival of the fittest over the generations. So what is it about these three things and how does awe drive them?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because, like you said, with many emotions, right? If we think of like universal human emotions that we all experience to various degrees, but wherever you look on the globe, people describe that anger, fear, sadness, and all that. They make sense on a certain level of like, oh, yeah, of course we'd want that. It's going to aid in our survival process. Awe can on the surface feel a little bit out there. But as you say, like one of the really fascinating parts of it is sort of looking at it from the other direction of what do these experiences of awe do to us? How do they change us? How do they change our perceptions? How do they, impact us emotionally? And there are a lot of benefits to awe that go beyond this. But, in my book, I do talk about those three, what I call the three C's of awe, letter C, not ocean C, connection, compassion, and curiosity. We know that it's been described as the ultimate collective emotion, for one thing, by a number of those researchers who've done a lot of that work, that when we experience this emotion, we feel much more part of the broader group, the broader collective. We see ourselves as part of a broader human species. And you see this even with really interesting stuff coming out to this day in terms of like how these moments make people care about, people that they've never met halfway around the world. It creates much more global consciousness, so to speak, is another way to think about that. But it's very connecting. It also spurs altruism much more than other positive emotional states. So it's not just simply that, oh, it feels good, so I'm going to be more generous, more giving. Seems to be something unique about awe that really seems to, open ourselves up to both be more connected. And these are all interrelated, of course, but not only more connected and feel like, oh, I'm at one with the others, but also more generous, more giving, more pro-social. And that's another sort of secondary finding that's really interesting. And then the third is this impact on things like curiosity. Which makes sense when we think about it, right? Like if I look up at an incredible sunset or the Milky Way or whatever it might be, or top of a mountain, we sort of feel this in ourselves. We want to know what that's about. We're in an ancient
Yeah.
grove of redwood trees. We want to know, like, how long have these been here? So I think many of us have felt that experience, that link between awe and curiosity. But that's a third area. And those three, by the way, you could also think of as just benefits, because there's incredible benefits to curiosity, to benefits for the giver in terms of kindness, as opposed to just the person receiving kindness. There's great research on that, on connection. I would actually say connection is in some way, and great book that just came out from Robert Waldinger on this, in terms of just, the Harvard study looking at 80 plus years of data that social connection really is the most important, arguably the most important factor for well-being across the lifespan. So those are benefits, but they're also, I think, explanations to some degree of, like, why did we evolve to have this seemingly strange emotion, reverence and awe, in our universal human catalog of emotions, so to speak?
Yeah, and what probably is jumping out to the listener, and for sure is to me, Jonah, is you talked earlier about the research and the studying you've done on the good life and positive psychology. And all of a sudden you write a book on awe. And so the question that jumps out is, why was this the topic you decided to research? Why awe? And what was it about it that made you think, this is something I got to chew on, dig into, and write a book on? Because anytime you choose to write a book on something, it's something you want to go deep on. So what was it for you that made this the topic?
Yeah, great question. And I think with a lot of people, if you're going to write a book, it's good to have it be personally meaningful to you, and sort of something that you're not going to be bored of after a few months. So certainly that was not the case with me. I think it was a few little factors. One is just this intellectual curiosity on the good life, as we've said, but also on a personal level. Like, when I think about moments in life that have, and I write about a number of them in the book too, but like moments that I want to remember when I'm, knock on wood, 80 years old, that I look back on life, and, those peak experiences of life for me have often had to do a lot with experiences of awe. So I kind of knew that in the back of my mind. And then it was actually like a personal experience being on a trip with my wife, incredible rainstorm that hit us, and we were on a beach. We kind of hustled back to the car. It was torrential. And then we looked up right as we sort of were about to pull away, and it was the most incredible double rainbow we'd ever seen, the most idyllic setting. And I just was filled with this immense feeling of awe in that moment. And for me, I had that moment, literally an epiphany on that vacation, where I said, I want to find out, like, as much as I can about this. And I think I've figured out what I want to write about. So we hustled back to the sort of little rented place we were staying. I think it was the only 56K wire, like, dial-up modem left in the world. So I was like, spent all night just at a snail's pace, learning about everything that had been started to be looked at with this emotion. And at the time, no books had been written on it, really. And that has changed, by the way, for listeners. There's actually like 2 to 3, I think, 3 awesome books on awe, no pun intended, that just came out too. I should probably be touting my own book, Clint, but buy mine too. But there are also 3 really good books, including one by Dr. Keltner, who's done so much of the primary research on awe, that just came out, I think, about a month ago. So anyways, nothing at the time, though. So that's where my writing project started. But I would say, actually, if I could say one other thing on a personal level, it wasn't until after I'd actually started to write the book that I really felt the healing power of awe and moments of awe for me, which was actually more during the pandemic, and picking up a pandemic hobby, as some of us did. And mine happened to be investing in a pretty high power, heavy duty, lug it around telescope that I would take out to these different dark sky locations. And when I would look up amidst all that uncertainty that was in the world at the time, and all the loss and the sort of the pain that was happening societally, all around, I would just feel it melt away in those moments, like when you're looking at a galaxy that's literally millions of light years away. So that was, for me, in some ways, like the application in my own experience happened more even post writing the book, as I started to get really into that. Because for me, that is as awe-inspiring as you get. For listeners, it might be something totally different that gives you that feeling. But for me, that's one of the big ways.
Yeah, and we'll dive into some of the different ways people can cultivate awe in their life, and where you did some of the dark stargazing with the telescope. I had been to one of the places you mentioned in the book and had awe-inspiring moments for a different reason. So can't wait to get to that part with you. But before we do, you highlight in the book there are also some health benefits, evolution aside.
Mm-hmm.
There are some health benefits we can experience from awe. And you highlight 5 or 6 in the book, and 3 that I thought maybe we could dive into. You talked about awe helps us be happier and more satisfied with life, reduces our stress levels, and helps us be more humble and reduces self-importance.
Yeah.
I thought those might be 3 good ones we could tackle together for the listener.
Yeah. And that was one of the most eye-opening parts for me in learning and writing and, experiencing so much of this was, I used to look at these moments of awe as being very memorable, but almost like the cherry on top of a good life sundae.
Yeah.
Nice if you have it, but, it's not the most important thing. And I was really, I think it's good to go into a writing project or anything with a really open mind and, not have your preconceived notions and see where that learning takes you. And one of the things that really surprised me, I remember, was just learning all about the impact of awe, the incredible effects that it has on our mood, even on our body. Like we'll get to later, I'm sure, with like inflammation, but even from,
Yes.
from like a mental health standpoint, incredible shifts when it comes to depression, stress, even PTSD, really amazingly. So yeah, whatever we want to get into with that, but I'll just kind of snapshot for the listeners. I think one thing that's really interesting is it not only boosts our mood, which is nice, that's like how we feel in the here and now, but it also shifts our sense of life satisfaction. And sometimes people, oh, those sound the same. But like, if you think about it, how I feel day to day does not always correlate by any stretch with more the second question, which is when I step back and look at my life as a whole, how do I feel
right.
about where
Yeah.
things are? Right. And sometimes those go in complete opposite. I might be feeling good because I'm, having a good moment, but feel pretty dissatisfied with the state of my life. Or you might be having a crappy day, but step back and say, but actually I feel good about, relationally, personally, professionally. And, so actually awe seems to impact each of those for different reasons. One is sort of the mood state. It just sort of feels good, as we know from a lot of these moments of awe. But also it's it's an experience that lends itself to perspective more than many other, what we would think of as like pleasant emotional states. It really, to me, like if you were to put it into words, which is hard to do, it's like this idea of the small stuff that stresses me out a lot of the time doesn't feel so important when we are surrounded by something that's ancient or awesome in that way. And it totally shifts the things that tend to weigh us down a lot of the time on a day-to-day level. So I think that's one big thing that you see.
And so when you talk about the mental health, you talk about the inflammation, it was interesting, this idea that they put people in MRIs, they hook the electrodes up, the heart rate monitors. What are some of the things they find that are happening inside the body that tie to awe when we're experiencing it?
Yeah, first off, I hate getting MRIs. So if you're a listener, don't volunteer for the next study that they're doing on that in particular. But as you said, they've looked at it from a few different angles, a lot of the people doing some of this amazing research. And I think 2 that jump out to me that I'll just mention. One has to do with a lot of those, functional MRI scans where you're essentially, whether it's through a video or a memory, you're encouraging or inviting the participant to think about or to get in touch with an experience of awe. And you're looking at, well, what changes in the brain when they do that? And a couple of the really sort of big shifts that you see, just in kind of layman's terms, one is the default mode network of our brain, which tends to be really active when we're self-judging, when we're in our own head, ruminating, the way a lot of us tend to a lot of the time. That goes almost completely offline. So we're as present and centered as you get, which we know from our own experience. You don't need a brain scan to tell you on some level, right? Like when you feel this emotion, you are present, you are locked in. Second thing is like part of the brain called the parietal lobe that sort of helps us feel oriented to the physical world around us, that becomes less active. And a lot of people describe during powerful moments of awe, kind of again mirroring some of that psychedelic stuff from earlier, this sense of like blurring of those lines between self, other, between me and the world around me. So it's a very like connecting state oftentimes, especially during those powerful moments. There's like those boundaries diminish a bit during that.
Mm.
And then you also see things like the release of oxytocin, which is a really like connecting neuropeptide, neurotransmitter. So the love hormone, as it's colloquially called, but it's a little more complicated than that. But like, what I think is interesting about that personally, by the way, is like, that's true even if you experience awe alone, which is wild. It's like, you could
Yeah.
be by yourself looking out at a beautiful vista, listening to an incredible, touching piece of music, no one else in sight, but you feel that and you are feeling more connected to others, to the world around you. So those are like three big changes that you see on a brain-based level that I think are fascinating. And then just the other piece I would mention, and then, don't want to keep talking your ear off about this, but like, it has to do with inflammation in our body, which, we know is linked, chronic inflammation specifically, like being linked to things like Alzheimer's, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, all, host of these physical health issues, but also depression as well. So mood disorders too. And we know that negative emotional states, which I know is a little bit of an overgeneralization. We need all of our emotions, by the way, everybody. It's like, don't try to never feel sad, never feel anxious. Like we're wired to have those feelings. But, unpleasant emotional states, when they're prolonged for long periods of time, like rumination, anxiety, depression, increase these markers of chronic inflammation in our body. But pleasant emotional states decrease those markers of chronic inflammation. But this is where it gets really interesting. In a comparison that was done of 7 different positive emotional states, awe was linked to the largest reductions of any of those emotions in terms of those markers of inflammation. So it's not just the fact it's pleasant.
Okay. It's
something specific to awe, more than like gratitude, more than pride, more than sort of the other ones that were studied. That seems to especially like help low. And why that is honestly a little beyond us at this point. But the fact that it's there, I think, is really, means we need to learn much more about that. Because if there's a link there, if feeling these wow moments lowers my inflammatory response, whole host of potential benefits to our body and our health that come with that too.
In some of the research you noted, it isn't just in the moment, but the power of awe seems to be long lasting. Yeah. What did that look like? How did they show that and illustrate that?
Yeah, I think and thank you for reminding me, because that I think is a really important point to highlight, is these moments can be very brief, right? We might feel a sense of awe, a sense of wonder for all of a few seconds sometimes. But what's really interesting is a lot of the boosts to things like our mood, to our stress level, even in some of the studies that like looked at post-traumatic stress, it wasn't just that people felt better on those kind of indexes later that hour. It was that actually days, even weeks later, for particularly powerful moments of awe, you could still see that like kind of afterglow, that residual effect from that. Now, I don't mean to say that every moment of awe is going to give us that. Everyone's different. Every experience is different. But there is borne out in that research that some of these moments, even if they're brief, even if they're very fleeting on the surface, actually stick with us in a really powerful way, which I, by the way, I had to check myself on that, because at first I was like, that seems too good to be true. But like, we don't have any problem believing that, do we, when it comes to like negative experiences in life? Like something bad happens to us and it's, I'm still thinking about it. I'm still impacted by this a week later. No one would look at you like you were losing your mind. But for some reason, these like very powerful ones were like, oh no, that seems too good to be true. At least I was, but certainly seems to be the case.
Well, let's dive in, Jonah. Let's dive into one of those negative ones that sticks with you maybe for the rest of your vacation. And so what jumped out at me there, and I'm sorry to bring you back to this one, but you were on a field trip with Kelly, and you were on a trail. Mm-hmm. And you came around a corner and saw a cute mama grizzly bear with a cub. Yes. And then I'll let you finish the rest of the story in the impact that you almost titled it a negative awe.
Yeah, and I have a whole chapter on that.
And what that did to you for the rest of the trip. So what happened, Jonah?
And I'm glad you brought this up, because, most of the time when we talk about awe, we are talking about those flashbulb moments of life that we want to remember. But not all awe, if you think about back to that definition, right, of like, I'm encountering something that's bigger than me, and it makes me reevaluate what I thought I knew. Like, that's actually a pretty neutral definition. You could apply that to things that are good or bad. So negative awe, is actually it's the minority of experience of awe that we have, but it is a real thing and it has different effects on us, as I'll speak to. But my personal experience on that was we were in Glacier National Park, so kind of the northern part of the U.S., very beautiful place. Like you said, we were coming around the corner on a trail, and it all happened so quickly. I remember we took a blind curve. We looked up the side of the hill to our left, and we saw like the adorable cubs who were like, you just want to pick them up. They're the cutest things you've ever seen. But then your mind remembers that where there is a cub, there's a mom. And so sure enough, about 50 feet to the, to the left, we saw the mama grizzly bear. She looked at us, she looked at the cubs, she measured us up, she looked at the cubs, and then she came just charging straight down the hill directly at me and my wife and me. And nobody tells you that they run faster than horses, grizzly bears, which is true. I had no idea. So we were about to collapse to the ground because she was about, 10, 15 feet away at this point. And at the very last second, she just kind of rises up on her hind legs. She gives us a big scare, sees that we're not coming after her cubs, and goes back up. So it was a bluff charge at the end of the day. But we were completely, terrified and in awe, frankly, of everything from just the ferocity, the protectiveness, the intelligence, right? To sort of do that in that moment and size us up at the last minute. The breathtaking beauty of this bear. I mean, there was a lot of, but in the moment, you're just feeling scared. But there was a difference to me between that sort of experience of just being afraid in general, right? Because we could be afraid of all kinds of things versus being afraid in that experience where there is an awe element. So it got me actually really curious about it. By the way, the rest of the trip, I did not leave the bear spray out of my hand. I was literally walking around with the finger on the trigger. And my wife was convinced I was going to accidentally hear a twig snap and get her with the bear spray. So that would have been a problem for a number of reasons. Probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But it got me really interested of negative awe as a real thing. And there's been some attention paid to that too. And, that doesn't have to be from a bear. You can think of things like the Challenger explosion or 9/11 or, any sort of natural disasters or, we have terrible fires here in California. And there's an awe element of just the speed of which some of this happens, the power, the way that as advanced as we are as human beings, we're still at the mercy of so much of this. So there's an awe element. And what's interesting is compared to just straight negative experiences, the negative awe experiences, they don't give us all the benefits that we've talked about. It's you're not going to have all these great things happen to your mood and your inflammation per se, but they do tie back to some of those things that I mentioned earlier, especially around connection and compassion. So people really do feel after these, whether it's on an individual or more of a collective experience of these negative awe experiences, do feel this sense of belonging, the sense of community, the sense of looking after each other, far more than even if it's just a negative, painful experience. So there is a kind of a connecting quality and a pro-social quality even to those negative awe experiences.
Even as you describe the mother bear barreling down the hill, just the imagery, and you talk about this, and we'll get to it later, but the imagery that it brings up in your mind, it's an awe-invoking image. And as you're telling the story, I'm praying it doesn't end like Leonardo DiCaprio in that movie where the grizzly gets a hold of him.
I'm glad I didn't watch that before.
Reverend, I believe. I believe. Yeah, just a horribly scarring scene from a movie.
A very graphic scene, actually.
Very graphic. They definitely did not spare the viewer on that one. And so what I thought we could do now, because then for the rest of the book, what you do is you take people through, here's different ways that you can cultivate awe in your life. And for each chapter, you might offer 5 or 6. And I thought, I'd highlight one that jumped out at me. And then you can go whichever way you want. You can go deep into that one or highlight a couple that you really enjoy about that area. The first one, as soon as I saw awe in nature, the first thought that jumped to my mind was this idea of forest bathing. And then I flipped to the next page and there it was. And the interesting part is I've never actually done it. Now, I live in British Columbia. We have beautiful forests. I do find that when I was trail running or when I was running, and then I started to get back onto the trails, there was something about being on the trails in the forest brought me back to childhood, this centeredness with nature. And it was just, there was this love affair with the forest. But I keep hearing about forest bathing, and I keep hearing about the idea, even while I'm in my mindfulness meditation circles. So part of what I wondered on this one is, what is forest bathing? Can we bring the listeners up to speed?
Yeah.
And how does nature invoke so much on us? And what are some ways you would throw at people to say, hey, here's how you can use nature to get in touch with awe?
Yeah, great question. And maybe to contextualize this for the listeners, because I might talk about an example, or we might talk about a particular approach that doesn't resonate for a listener. And, one of my goals in writing that second part of the book, and I run through it's about 10 different chapters within that section with about, like you said, about 5, 6, 7 different suggestions. And they're really meant to be like a shopping cart approach for people, that something might really resonate for you, give it a try. If something else is not your thing, I've a good friend that I was just talking to who's just like not a museum person. Last, like, cannot get him to a museum. And instead of fighting him on that, great. Don't take that suggestion, because that could be a place for some of us to experience awe, but you really want to think about like what works for you. So yeah, going through these different kind of what I think of them as like pathways to awe, whether it's nature and others that we'll talk about, like gratitude, connection, and others. Within nature, there's been this really fascinating thing for any listeners that are not as familiar, stemming out of this movement coming out of Japan called Shinrin Roku, which translates to forest bathing, and really was meant, it was sort of originated with this recognition that we've become increasingly separate from, increasingly divorced from the natural world, many of us. Even those of us living in somewhat close proximity, still spend a lot of our days under a roof, within walls, looking at screens. And so, let alone if you live in a large city and you just don't have quite as much access to it. So it was really started from that recognition. And people hear the word forest bathing, like, oh, is that like finding a natural spring and going skinny dipping in the forest? That sounds nice too. But it's really more about just being in the forest. It's just connecting to green spaces, really merging things like mindfulness and nature, but in a way that's it's not about hiking. It's not about exercise. That's great too. It's not about getting your steps in. It's really just about using your senses to connect fully to that natural space. So really feeling your feet beneath you. Take off your shoes if you can. Use your sense of touch and kind of feel the trunks of the trees or the grass beneath you. Hear what's there or not, right? Like sometimes the silence of a forest is an incredible sound, right? At first it sounds like you're not hearing anything, and then you start to notice 10, 20, 30 different concurrent sounds happening. And you're like, wow, I'm hearing nature. I never hear this. So using those senses to just fully make contact with, close your eyes, open your eyes, kind of mix it up and just connect with that natural world. And it's been shown not just to like feel good in that moment, but forest bathing as a whole actually has like a host of other benefits with things like blood pressure, heart rate variability. So there's like a lot of benefits that come from just connecting with green spaces. On that note, by the way, before I forget, cool study that just came out looking at doing exercise in nature, because you mentioned running, versus doing the same level of exertion, but in a completely unnatural environment, and showing that actually doing it in a natural space, in a green space, so kind of green exercise, so to speak, led to not only greater benefits in terms of like the level of stress in the body and so forth, but actually greater enjoyment. So it's another way to kind of make it more self-reinforcing.
Yeah, 100%. In what I explain to people is when you're running on that trail relative to when you're running on the street, there's an element of play. There's an element of bringing you back to your childhood. You got to be paying attention to the rocks on the trail and the mud pile, puddles and jumping over a root. And the other thing that really jumped out at me, Jonah, and maybe it was forest bathing, and it was just such a pleasure with our two young boys through COVID. and this will sound crazy. They're 11 and 14. So let's rewind the clock 2, maybe 3 years.
Uh-huh.
So they're 12 and 10. And we're walking on the trail with my wife and them in beautiful forest. And they've never been in a forest, not on a trail.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say to them, well, let's leave the trail. Like, let's just go in the forest. My wife, she wants to keep walking on the trail. And we say, okay, well, this trail goes in that direction. So we're going to meet you somewhere in that direction and just take the two of them, get off the trail and just walk through the trees and over creeks and navigate around little ponds. And, you're moving branches out of your way and they're snapping back at you. And just the joy of being in the forest, in the dirt. And it's, to your point, it was so strange to me. And maybe it's my fault as their parents and living in the city.
Must have been amazing to see them going through that too. I was just thinking their reactions to that. Wow.
Like the reactions to them being in a forest for the first time and just the smiles and the joy. And you're like, well, why don't you pick up a stick so that you can guide your way through the water, and just seeing them pick a stick and hold it in their hands as their walking staff, and like a bit of a sense of reverence and awe.
Absolutely.
For the forest, for nature.
Yeah. I think it sounds like you did some version of forest bathing without necessarily calling it that. Because think about how present you all were, how connected you were to the land. I mean, these are things that we just spend very little of our lives fully doing in that kind of real way. And even when we do, it's like, we're going to go on a hike, we're going to go on this trail. So to kind of really connect at that deeper level, like you did, is amazing. And, by the way, seeing awe in others gives us awe, right? So that's another kind of little hack.
There you go. Yeah.
So we feel a sense of reverence when we connect with, I'm just showing again what an interpersonal emotion it is. But also on the kid angle, I'm reminded, like, kids are really good at being awe-inspired. Maybe not once they reach their teenage years, but like they were a little younger at the time. And just seeing, kind of rediscovering in ourselves, for listeners, I think, the sense of childlike wonder, where it's like, we take so much for granted as we get older. We get so jaded. We get so in the routines.
That's right.
To shake up that system and be like, wow, I'm eating this meal that I've had 100 times, but like, what an incredible gift. Where did this come from? Let me taste every bit of the flavor. Let me think about sort of how they figured out how to make this. Like, I was eating an artichoke recently, and I thought to myself, this is going to sound like the silliest example in the world, but I was like, who the heck figured out how you could eat an artichoke? If you hold one and you're like, that does not, I would have just picked that up and thrown it away if I was 1,000 years ago. But to know what to do. So it's like getting curious about that is something we can kind of do, and something we might have seen 100 times in our lives, 1,000 times, can be fresh if we see it through those new eyes.
Absolutely. And for the listeners, what are 1 to 2 of the ways that you love to use nature to connect with all?
Yeah. So, I mean, I did not, just for context, grow up as a nature guy. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York.
You mentioned that.
Yeah. And it was like, when I came out to California, I remember for the first time, and one of the first places I went, and I didn't actually get to travel that much when I was growing up. I love to travel now. It's like a huge passion of mine. And unfortunately, I subjected readers to a lot of those stories as well in the book Awestruck. But I remember I came out here for graduate school, and one of the first places I went was Muir Woods, which is like this big redwood area in a little north of San Francisco. And I didn't even know trees grew to that size. I'd seen buildings that size, right? But the idea of like a tree that size, and then learning how some of them are 2,000 years old, and thinking about what was happening in the world 2,000 years ago when that tree was a little seedling. And I was smitten, like, from that first experience. I remember I was like, didn't see myself as a nature guy. And I was like, maybe I am. And then my wife is a huge nature person. So she's really like stepped it up and gotten me to the next level with camping and with hiking and all of that. But for me, nature is one of the places that really does this for me. And, in addition to things like forest bathing, I think it's just, yes, I love to go to national parks. I love to sort of see these natural spaces. But I actually think, like, in the spirit of what we've talked about, it's important to find the beauty kind of like that's around us. So I have a walk in my neighborhood, which is not a national park, but just noticing like different colors of subtle changes in the leaves, or watching a hummingbird, or like, in other words, you could be in a city and just, any semblance of a green space, just getting curious and kind of feel that sense of connection to that in ways that maybe are more accessible to a lot of us on an everyday level. So yes, there's like the big adventures of life that I think are great to do, but I think, finding more ways, like in a way that's sustainable for you, to connect to the natural world in ways big or small. Sunsets, if you have access to that, just trees, small parks, animals. I'm a huge animal person, and just realizing that we can have relationships with living animals is like a mind-blowing, awe-inspiring thing when you actually stop to think about it. So yeah, I think what writing the book has done for me, and by the way, listeners, I'm far from perfect on it. I have to remind myself all the time of this stuff, but I think it has reinforced in me this idea that like so much of life is wondrous. Our very existence is like the biggest miracle that you get. Like the odds of any of us being here is as close to zero as you get without being zero. And yet here we are having this conversation. So I think when we look at life from that lens, so much is magical. Even the thing like breathing is magical. Sight is magical. Having this conversation in real time through a screen.
Yeah, like some electronic components that are pulling us together across the world. It's all mind-boggling. You made me think too, because you don't think about some of these things until they're spurred. And I live in the city, but the way they designed this neighborhood, somewhere in the 80s, they sold the laneway, so I would otherwise have a laneway. And one of the two people that bought it for these long single-family homes, they planted trees. And so I had these trees that I can sit on my deck in the summer, and I can see this 60 plus, 70-foot plus tree in the neighborhood that just, like, there's this sense of awe of, well, I live in the city, yet that tree makes me feel like I'm in the burbs, makes me feel like I'm in my childhood and I'm near forest, even though there's not, because 20 feet from that, there's a high school and there's a busy street with shops and restaurants. But that tree makes me think that I'm not in the city. And there's an awe to that. And I thought the next one that jumped out at me was when we went to this idea of vastness. You talked about Sedona, and I was in Sedona 6 or 7 years ago, or 7 or 8 years ago on a trip with work. And the guys we were with, we went mountain biking the first day. I fell off my bike, hit my head. And so the next day when they were going back on the bikes, I said, I'm going to take today off. I'm just going to go for a run by myself. And I went out for a run, probably 15 to 20 miles. Alone.
I'm already in awe of that, by the way, 15, 20-mile run.
Back then I was a runner, and I was doing a bit of a run streak, and ended up doing some ultras. It was a fun phase. I got to get back to it. But I ended up in those red rocks, right? And I had no direction, just out, see where I'm going. The heat of Sedona kind of beaming down on you, so I've got the sweat going. And just the vastness, like everywhere I looked was just red rock and like massive scale. And there was something, it's not till you think about it when you're reading about it, but it was about significance, right? Like I am so small relative to this vast rock plain, if you will. And another spot where that came up for me was we were at Joshua Tree with the family. And we did this little hike with the kids, and then they were all going to eat. And I said, well, I want to play in these rocks by myself. So I just started sort of free climbing, which was bad because it was much easier to go up than come down, and that got scary. But it was that same, because probably not far from you, right? And so
a little south. But yeah,
little set, but that vastness. And so, what is it about vastness that brings on that awe. What are some of the ways you like? I mean, you have your
Yeah.
telescope, so I know you like to explore the stars. So what is it about
Really,
vastness that does it for us?
yeah. I'd say oddly enough, I'm a telescope and an ocean person. I mean, that's another place that I just
Oh,
feel completely tiny. I've always sort of been a water person in that way. If I love California, Northern California, but I do fantasize of like being in a warm water place someday as like a ongoing
yes.
basis. That would be heavenly for me. But yeah, to your point too, like about the red rocks and these places too, there's vastness both in the like, it's interesting because it actually combines both the like perceptual and conceptual vastness in a sense that, there's the physical vastness, like I'm surrounded just by this infinite red rock. But then when you start to wrap your head around how ancient it is,
Yes.
then it's like,
Yes.
wow, I am just this, like the geologic timepiece is impossible to wrap your head around, that I get to exist in this moment, to be surrounded by this experience. I'm a blip. So, to that point, I think one of the things vastness really does to us is it makes us feel small, but not in a way that's threatening. And so with awe, there's even this interesting phenomenon that's called the small self effect, which is like when we experience awe, we literally feel smaller. But unlike, a person who's, say, struggling with depression, where they feel I'm small, I'm insignificant in the world around me, when we experience awe, we feel small, yet we feel connected to something bigger. So it doesn't threaten us in that way. It's actually like almost a peaceful feeling for many people, where yes, I feel like a speck in this vast universe, like if I'm looking at the night sky or looking at the ocean or whatever it is, and yet I get to be a part of it. How incredible. And these vast places, I think, hammer home that reality and that perspective more than almost anything does, especially when you can combine just the scale with that sort of more intellectual knowledge, whether it's how ancient, looking at light that's from millions of light years away, or surrounded by red rocks that have been there for billions of years. Like this is all just mind blowing when you pause to think about it.
And so as you say that, what really jumps out is the NASA photos that they
Yeah.
released earlier, well, I guess last year.
Mhm.
And I mean, talk about imagery that gives you that sensation of I am a flea in this universe. But to your point, it's not an overwhelming nor a negative feeling. It's almost freeing.
Yeah, I experienced that. I will say, like some listeners, maybe not. I have a good friend that when I send him those pictures from the James Webb telescope, he freaks out. He gets existential dread. He says, "Don't send those to me anymore." So it's all individual. But I'm totally with you. Like for me, it is this complete perspective shift where if I'm worried about, you name it, did I respond to that email? Did that person, were they disrespectful? Was I rude unintentionally in that situation? Stress over money, all these things. Like, by the way, some of these are real stress, but at the same time, compared to just the mere like unlikelihood of existence and us being a part of it, many of the things that we obsess over and consume over really lose their importance to some degree when we do that. And I think one interesting thing that you see with awe is it also helps to orient people towards more meaningful values, right? So it's not like it makes people like
Yes.
just become a deadbeat and like, oh, I just want to look up, it's like actually it sort of primes us to say like, I get to be part of this experience for at least a short period of time. How do I want to live my life in a way that's meaningful, right? What matters to me at the end of the day? How do I not lose sight of that? And I think awe helps remind us of that.
And something that, when we think of the James Webb and we think of small self effect, is one of the terms that I think I've heard that ties to this. Is it that idea of cosmic insignificance,
Mm-hmm.
that when we're seeing this vast, we realize how insignificant we are. And for some people, like we said, it's freeing. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, well, who cares? Like,
Yep.
let go. And for other people, it can be just dread because it's,
Yeah.
whoa, I'm
Mm-hmm.
insignificant and I thought I was everything.
Yes. Yeah, if you
Mm.
ever look at like some of the zoom out images of like, here's Earth, and then it sort of backs up, and you see our solar system, and then you see our galaxy, and then you see other, our galaxy in the context of thousands of I mean, you keep zooming out, and you realize like how many lives have been lost, how many mental energy has been spent, how many, for sort of things that are really not that important at the end of the day. If we have that sense of, we tend to think whatever's right in front of us is the most important thing in the world. But I think perhaps for that reason, that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier, how like experiences of awe actually kind of connect us to the larger global community. It makes us more compassionate, not just to the people right around us, but even to people halfway around the world. So there's even been interesting recent studies looking at, which I couldn't put in the book because it's come out more recently, but like people experiencing awe become more concerned about global things that don't affect them so much directly, but affect someone halfway around the world. So it makes you like a better global citizen in a way when you see yourself as part of this big interconnected web of life with other humans, with animals, with species, with everything. So I think that's a really, yes, you can go to the insignificance piece, but there's also the kind of empowering piece of like, I am one with everything in a sense, both on earth and perhaps beyond.
All right, we got to go backwards now. We got to go back to mindfulness because it's interesting, and you don't get there often when you're meditating. Because one of the interesting parts, I remember I had a Buddhist teacher for a while, and I was working with Casey, and we were talking about, he'd be asking me how I'd be feeling, and it was through COVID. So I'd say, well, I'm feeling a bit anxious. And so we started to explore that together. And he would say, okay, well, first of all, let's play with labels. Let's not necessarily label it anxious. Let's talk about you're feeling the sensation that you label anxious. Okay, great. That's a good point. And let's explore how vast it is. And we're exploring it. And then let's explore consciousness. Let's think about your awareness and let's meditate on your awareness. How vast is it? And I thought about it for a while and I thought, man, is he throwing one of these Buddhist trick questions at me? And I just said, it feels infinite. He said, yeah, there is no limit. And it's, wow. Like my mind can stretch into infinity. There's no boundaries to our awareness. And when you start to think about that and meditate on it in this little tiny anxious energy in my chest, and he would say, well, how small is that energy relative to your awareness? And it's like a flea. Like it's nothing.
Wow.
And it's like, yeah, well, if it gets to an 8 or a 9 or a 10, talk to your doctor. But if it's a 3 or a 4, just go through this exercise. Just feel it in relation to this awareness. And the problem, you can get there but so often we're meditating and we're trying to get to that stillness, to that spot where we're one with the universe. And it's, you rarely get there. But when you do, it's like, oh, how vast not only is the world, but how vast is inside of us. And that, it's like that feeling of awe that makes you want to get back to the mat and to get back to that.
That was I got goosebumps just listening to that example because that is awesome. And I think, by the way, like so much we can learn from this wisdom that's been around for so much further than clinical psychology as a field, and just how we can relate to the experiences that we all have, right? That you described without medicalizing it, without medicating it, without pathologizing it, and just changing our relationship to those experiences for many of us is such a better route to take. I love that example, that story.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me.
The next area that I'd love to get some of your favorite ones on is you talked about mind bending on in the power of our mind. And as I was reading it, one of the things I did to exercise it was my dog was on the couch with me. And you mentioned stuff like this earlier in the conversation. And I just looked over at her in this relationship you have with your pet. I just, stared into her eyes. And I started talking to her and saying, hey, daddy loves you and you're a good girl. Yep. And, just that interaction you have, just all of a sudden her tail was just hammering the couch. You could just see like that eye contact, the voice. She was like, yeah, this bond is, I'm feeling it too. And just that awe of that relationship and that love you have with your pet, like that just always blows me away. When it comes to using our mind to generate awe, what are some of the favorites that you have, Jonah, that you use? And what are some of the ones that our listeners can be thinking about?
And I love that example too, because I'm a big animal person. And like with so many things, we just go through life without really thinking about it. And I think like part of the trick is to really pause and really dissect and really get curious about this experience that we're having every day. Like you having a connection with your dog. You're like, oh, I love my dog. My dog loves me. You don't think about it twice, but it's like, what does that really mean to have a conscious sort of connection with a sentient animal like this, that there's genuine that's crazy to think about. And yet many of us who love animals, experience that. So I think, with, when we talk about the two types of awe or I should say two types of vastness, I think one of the things that we can often do in our mind is really get in touch with that second type of vastness, the conceptual vastness. So you can be on the red rocks and be in touch with those red rocks. But I think to sort of then take a step back and think about what are those made of and how did that get created? How long have they been around? And can I even begin to wrap my head around how many zeros that is in terms of like the number of years since? So, almost just taking that curiosity on steroids approach is one way to think about this. But I write about a few other prompts in that chapter that have helped me really just get that sense of awe on more of like an internal level. So it's less about going out and finding things that wow me or finding things, but it's more about how am I engaging in the world? What is my approach? What is my mindset? And one of the things I write about is that unlikelihood of existence, right? Like if you really stop and think about, like if we were to calculate out the odds of all of our ancestors living long enough to pass their genes along, the odds that none of them would have died in childbirth, none of them would have died in warfare, none of them would have died of famine, none of them would have died in the Black Death. I mean, keep going of all the unlikelihood of every link in the chain getting to this point, the unlikelihood that that particular egg and sperm get together, right? Like we are basically, if you were to play that out, we should not be here. None of us should be here. And yet about 8 billion of us are. And that's absolutely incredible to think about just how unlikely that is. So that's one way that I sort of definitely think about it. The other is that time perspective, right? Like you're in the redwoods and you think about 2,000 years. You're in the red rocks and you're thinking a lot more than that. But if we think about just how long Earth has been around and how long Homo sapiens have been around, as if it was like a long, stretched out ruler. And there's a little spotlight. I borrowed this from I think Richard Dawkins in the book, but like, that light is hitting just at a particular moment. Everything before us is dark. Everything behind us is dark. And yet we get to exist in this moment right here and right now. What a gift. And to really kind of get in touch with that unlikelihood of not just existing period, but existing now. So those are like a couple of the ways that I really try to at least remind myself of this gift, which again is a intention that I said. It's a reminder that I need because there's plenty of days, right, listeners, where I'm like not remembering half of this stuff. But I think if I can get, 1% better at remembering it each step along the way, then I'll be on my way. At least by the time I'm 90.
Yeah, well, it's like everything. It's like everything. There's so many things that we should do, we could do, we want to do. We should drink more water. We should wake up at this time. We should meditate. It's like, well, there's only so much time in a day.
There's only so many hours. That's right.
If we hit these periodically, we're in good shape. And when you talked about that exercise of contemplating human life, and I don't know if you'd ever heard they talk about one of the concepts in Buddhism is there's the 4 thoughts that turn the mind to Buddhism. And you have this idea of the preciousness of human life. And it's exactly, I do the same exercise you do where, well, my father had to meet my mother and their parents had to meet each other and their parents. And what if just one of them in that chain never met all the way back to cave people? We wouldn't be here. Yeah. And so everything that had to happen for you to be here, just the preciousness of that life And then you immediately go to number 2. We won't go into 3 and 4, but number 2 is impermanence.
Mm-hmm.
None of what's here will be here. Your house, your possessions, your family, your wealth, that's all going to be gone. And so just that, going back to that cosmic insignificance and the smallness of self. 1, the power of being here. 2, will all be gone. Yes. And when you look at those 2, there's just so much awe in those 2 alone.
Yes.
That it just blows me away. And then as you were talking there, I started to have awe at what you were saying, which ties to the next chapter, which is this idea of genius and courage and inspiration, and the fact that we can watch the Super Bowl and you can see a pass and you're just, you're all texting each other. Did you guys just see what Patrick Mahomes did? Or, on a broken ankle, and just this awe of athletes, or Rihanna at the halftime, or so what is it about this awe of genius or athletic prowess that brings us all in, and how can we use that in our daily lives?
Yeah, I will just say, as a Buffalo Bills fan, Patrick Mahomes, I have conflicted relationships with him, but but that aside, he is very awe-inspiring. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. Around the world, so if you look kind of globally in terms of, awe's been studied around, I think, 45, 50 countries at this point that I'm familiar with. Actually, the number 1 source of awe around the world that people report on average is actually other people. In the U.S., it's nature, but on a more global scale, it's other people, which would be things like, I'm in awe of that person's ability. I'm in awe of that person's courage. I'm in awe of that person's, convictions, their strength, their resilience, and we can think of, the people that we read in the news, that we learn about in school, kind of on one end of that spectrum. But I think also just getting in touch with the courage and strength of people that we encounter on a much more humble level, like the people fighting battles that no one else knows about. Fighting there's an incredible awe that we can feel that has to do with that, like, moral beauty. John Haidt called it elevation, right? As sort of this idea of, like, for lack of a better term, like moral awe. So it's like different from the awe that I feel looking up at the mountain, but I'm in awe of that person on some level. It elevates me. It kind of brings me up in that way. So, I think what I try to get at in that chapter is there's so many sort of examples through people, through fellow human beings, that can inspire us to do better, that can, kind of show us what's possible when people have conviction. And that could be, by the way, like watching a great basketball player, football player do their thing. It could be a great musician. It could be an incredible artist. It could be an actor whose performance just blows our mind. It could be a leader who's, fighting to make the world a better place, at great risk to themselves. Like, there's countless examples of this, both in the present and in the past. And I just encourage readers, in that section of the book, to get really curious about that, to think about, like, who are the people that we can see the best of humanity in, to both boost us in that moment, show us what's possible, but also inspire us to, whatever that looks like in our quarter of the world, to pursue excellence, to be at our best, to, be the best version of ourselves that we can become over time.
And you talk about the idea of goosebumps, and there's something for sure about when you see, whether it's American Idol or just a video online, and you see someone sing, and I'm pretty tone deaf, but when I get goosebumps when someone's singing, I know, wow, that's good.
Yeah, and goosebumps often are like a little clue that, oh, this is one of those moments. In fact, behind cold temperature, awe is the second most common source of goosebumps, oddly enough.
That makes sense to me.
I've been experienced. But yeah, we know that the hair on the back of our neck stands up. We feel those goosebumps. There's something about that experience that, brings those chills down, our spine in a way that very few experiences do. It's like we're witnessing something that's magical, that we can't quite put the words to it, but we know it's special.
Yeah, it's a good way to describe it, because otherwise I have no idea why these goosebumps are here, but I know I like that singer.
Yes.
And so the last one I want to talk about, and then people can go read all the amazing adventures themselves, is this idea of habit. And something that really jumped out at me for this one is, I don't know if you've done heart rate variability training is one of the things on your journey, but
I always wanted to.
it's very fascinating. I love it because I almost refer to it as quantitative meditation. And so for those who are listening, this could be pseudoscience, sure, but you have a device that measures your heart rate and how it varies. And there's this idea that you can get into what they refer to as a state of coherence. And now someone will say to me, well, Clint, like, how do you know it's right? And then you're in a state of coherence. And all I can offer, Jonah, is that when it says you're in coherence, the feeling that you have in that moment or moments while you stay in it are extraordinary. You think to yourself, this is how I want to feel all the time. And so one of the things that you'll do to get to that state of coherence, so you might, for example, do box breathing. And then while you're doing it, you conjure an image or a memory that you have that put you into that sense of happiness. And to make it even better, you try to put yourself back into that memory. So for me, example, my oldest son, he's 14, but this is probably back when he's 3 years old. And we're back home where I grew up, and I'm teaching him how to ride a bike. And he's afraid of hills. But he lets me let go of him going down a hill. He trusts me for the first time, and I'm running beside him. I'm training, I'm fit at the time. And he just turns to me and he has the biggest smile on his face. And it's sunny, and he's screaming like, "Daddy, I'm doing it. I'm doing it." And he has this like look of love and happiness on his face, the happiest I've ever seen him in his life. And the way he's yelling that is pure joy. And I bring back that memory and just the awe of that day and that moment. And I'm able to get back to that sense of awe and that sense of, in that heart rate coherence. And so that for me is what's my habit to get me back to awe, is to just bring back that memory and go into it. What are some other ways we can use habits and in our daily lives to conjure that awe back into our life?
Well, I think what you said has such an important lesson, on many levels, but I think it's a really good point to sort of arrive at, because I don't think we've mentioned it yet. But essentially, we spend a lot of time as humans, like, looking for the next really good experience. We're kind of constantly on the lookout. Let me feel something different. Let me experience something new. And some of these new experiences are great. Don't get me wrong. But I think we spend a lot of time in our heads thinking about and replaying and reliving the painful parts of life. Head hits the pillow at night. Like, what are we often ruminating about? But, we know that for good or bad, when I am really deeply connecting to a memory, thinking about it, feeling it in my body, my nervous system, my brain even is responding in really similar ways to when that thing actually happened. We do that, unfortunately, it's like a superpower, but we do it for bad a lot of the time. And people like Rick Hansen talk a lot about sort of the importance of resting our attention on the good moments, right? And sort of through that process of neuroplasticity getting there. But I think with awe, it's a very similar thing. It's like, I'll say one thing I love to do is just, it's a balance. You don't want to be like behind your camera 24/7, but finding ways, like when you have these magical experiences, to hold on to them so you can re-experience them 5, 10, 15 times, right? Maybe it's a memento or a souvenir. Maybe it's you take one picture, just enough to kind of prompt you. Maybe you got out of your way to talk about the experience with someone else who you shared it with and kind of re-remember it together in that way. Years back, I got this like digital photo frame that would just kind of be on my desk, and it would cycle through. I got it for like a clearance rack at a Target, but it would cycle through different sort of memories from travels, beautiful moments that I maybe hadn't thought about in 2 years. And then I would see that picture and it would bring me right back. So prompts or intentions or journaling or just finding the ways that work for you so that these beautiful moments, they're great if they happen once, but we actually have some control over finding ways to reconnect, to remember, to get back in touch with those moments, even after the fact. And maybe it's not going to hit you as hard as, seeing it for the first time, but you can actually incorporate that experience and that emotional memory much more into our lives than we often do sometimes.
And even as you say that, just the idea of reading the book and reading about all, and then as I went through the chapter, saying, well, what's something that in this area sparked awe in me, and remembering it and thinking about it and having a conversation with you about it tonight, there's just my mood or my, go back, we talked about our sense of life. Mm-hmm. There's a lightness, there's a calmness, there's a happess.
Yes.
That, a long day, it's end of the night for both of us. We're both on the Pacific time zone. But there's like an energy and a joy that I'm going to go back in the house in the next couple hours. I'll just be really light. So there's something beautiful about having those conversations about awe that permeates through us.
I feel that as well. Long day, 6:00 comes or whatever it was, and we're like, I'm feeling tired. And then you start talking about this, sharing these memories, hearing your stories of these moments, that you've had yourself or with your family. And it's like, I feel a little bit of that, just picturing what you're describing and vice versa. Just having this at top of mind for both of us is, it shifts everything that's happening in your mind and your body. It's a great gift we can have for ourselves to just find more of these wow moments, even in small ways, whether we're going out and finding them or finding ways to reflect on them a little bit more than we do. I think just to have a bit more of this sense of wonder and amazement in our lives, we'd all be a little bit better off for it.
Absolutely. And Jonah, do you have time for the rapid final 4 questions we throw at everybody? All right, let's do it. So what has been one of the most life-changing books for you in your life?
I would say what I would say has probably been the most meaningful book, which now is going to sound like a bad pun, but it's probably Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Oh, yes, of course.
If I can claim it as a mental health psychology book, I think it's much bigger than that. But I would say of all the books in my relative field, that is like the one that I would have on a desert island that I try to reread every few years.
Well, and I've said it before, is, a lot of the self-help, the work, as we refer to it as, that I've done in my life has been specifically to increase the gap between the stimulus and response.
Yes.
So that I can be a better father, a better husband, and a better human. And the way he talks about it as where the magic happens in that moment, it's just, even if it's just that one line.
And speaking of awe, like to have that wisdom, having gone through that experience, that always gives me a sense of awe every time I read it. To
absolutely
emerge from hell with humanity and to see the beauty of life is amazing to me.
Yeah, and the two, Victor and then James Stockdale, a bit of a more stoic response to being a prisoner of war, but just listen, like reading both of them coming out of those two experiences.
Yeah.
And could live the rest of their life super jaded, and yet they put out the literature that they both did so that we can benefit from it in our lives, in our everyday lives. Just so meaningful.
Mind-blowing.
Great choice, great selection. What's on your bookshelf right now? What are you reading right now?
What am I reading? So I am actually reading right now a biography of Bo Jackson, the football and baseball player.
Oh my
the last folk hero. Speaking and awe-inspiring in a different way.
Yeah, don't know Bo. That's right. Yeah, I loved his. It was so sad when he got injured. Like he was just larger than life. when I was growing up.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's and I was and a book came out not long ago that sort of dives into everything from his childhood and his origin story, if you will, as like a superhero practically. And then I'm only about a third way through, but very much enjoying it at this point.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. What is something that Jonah has bought recently for under $1,000 that you've thought to yourself, wow, I should have bought this earlier. It's really made a big impact on my life.
That's a fantastic These are great questions. I wish I had time to prepare for your rapid fire questions, because then I would probably have better answers. The first thing that came to my mind was a really good bottle of wine that I got in Sonoma wine country.
Nice. That's always a good selection.
Not too long ago. This is going to sound like a very silly answer, but I am talking to you. I don't know. I won't wrestle with it too much, but after years of this pandemic, doing a lot more work on the computer, with the computer lying on my desk, I finally got a stand for my computer to rest on that I can look comfortably ahead. And it sounds like a very silly answer for $25, but considering how my neck was often feeling when I would be kind of looking down versus how it feels when I'm ending the day looking straight ahead like this, I'd probably say that actually. I got that a couple months ago. $20.
And it can often be something small. I mean, my wife, she had me, influenced my answer when I was on a podcast and they asked me, and it was the paper cloth that you buy that you wrap your cheese in.
Oh, yeah.
And apparently it makes the cheese last much longer, and it's simple to use. So for us, it was cheesecloth.
Awesome. I might be inspired to get some of that myself.
The last one for you on that is, what's one mindset shift, habit, or behavior change that had the most impact for you in your life?
This will sound, I think, a little cliche, but since I write so much about it, I would say when I was in grad school, starting to really learn about the many benefits of gratitude and like kind of really getting into a gratitude practice. I think, I used to just associate it with, Oprah and whatever. When I really found myself making that shift from focusing on, what I don't have, what I wish were different in my life, to really this like deep felt sense of, let me notice the good around me. Let me notice the beauty. Let me get in touch with the things in my life that I really feel are special, right? Because it's so easy to lose sight of them. I would say for me, that's been one practice that's just been with me ever since, and that I try to really, with intention, stay in touch with. Some days better than others, but that, I think, mindset creates such abundance in our lives, psychologically, emotionally, and otherwise, to notice what's right.
Yeah, and it's, you can definitely never sounds cliche to me on that one, because even when I talk about, the three areas that I usually talk about, psychology, success, and finance, being a CFO for the last 20 something years, what jumps out there is people don't realize the power of what you just talked about is the focusing on what you do have versus what you don't have, and how gratefulness helps you with that. Because when it comes to your money, you have enough as soon as you realize you have enough.
Yes.
And if you never practice gratitude and you're never grateful for what you already have,
and so many bad money decisions, I would imagine, come from a place
100%.
of, I need to do
100%.
more, I need to have more, I need to, and as opposed to just like, I feel good about this, let me invest the rest. So I think it has really practical results for sure.
100%. Yeah. So we've gone far and wide on the book. We've gone pretty deep and we've gone wide. What, if anything, have we missed that you want to make sure the listener gets?
I think we covered great ground on the book. I think, I'll just say it once more, because I think it's the take home of the book is, yes, there's the Grand Canyon, the ocean, the incredible red rocks that you described. But my invitation to everyone reading the book, listening, is really just to say, like, what is it today, right now, in this moment, that's actually wondrous, but that we don't think of as wondrous? What can you look out for tomorrow as you go about your routine day that's actually anything but routine, right? Turning on a faucet and having hot water come out is like incredible. Flipping a switch and light comes on is like magic. I was just giving, I'll leave you this, I gave a TEDx talk, so I'll plug that about 3 days ago on Awe at this TEDx
Oh,
Sonoma
great.
event.
Okay.
And as soon as the video is edited and released and uploaded to the YouTube channel, I will certainly announce it all over social media. But one of the other speakers was an actually Apollo 9 astronaut, which was really cool for me to like, holy crap, like that, this guy felt the overview effect. I'm just writing about it. But, as we were talking, we had this moment of like, we all have smartphones in our pocket that have more computing power than what it took to launch that Apollo mission.
Scary.
Both gives you a sense of awe for these phones. It's a little scary too, but it's also like, how did they manage to do that? That's wild. That's awe, right? In terms of their ability to do that. So, we have these magical moments all around us, these parts of life that we don't always see, that I think if we all leave here just noticing a little bit more of that magic, we'll be on the right track.
Awesome. And Jonah, where can our listeners find you?
Well, you can go to my website, which is just full name, jonahpaquette.com, if you want to read more about me or my books or kind of the work that I do, the speaking that I do. My most recent book was actually called Happily Even After, which focuses on resilience. Awestruck just before that. So those are two books of mine. And then, of course, you can find me on social media at Jonah Paquette PsyD on Instagram and Dr. Paquette on Twitter and on LinkedIn. For those of you on LinkedIn, you can just look for my name. And I'd love to connect with people and kind of hear about your experience of this conversation, or just connect with interesting people that are experiencing awe and all that comes with it out in their lives. So find me any of those places for sure.
Awesome. We will have all of that in the show notes. And so people will find that on our website. And thank you for joining me today. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me. This has been an honor.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.